Namaskar and welcome to Diplomatic Dispatch. I'm your host Vikas Swarup. As the 27th United Nations Conference on Climate Change, or COP27, gets underway in Egypt, we take stock of the global fight against climate change in this edition of Diplomatic Dispatch. COP27 is being held in Sharm el-Sheikh from November 6 to 18, and it comes against a backdrop of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, the Russia-Ukraine war, growing geopolitical tensions between the West and Russia, and the United States and China, record high energy prices, and a looming global recession. It also comes at a time when the impact of climate change is being felt everywhere, following a summer when heat waves broke records across the world. A drought in Africa put 22 million people at risk of starvation. Floods submerged one-third of Pakistan, and hurricanes are becoming more frequent and intense. That is why COP27 is being billed by the Egyptian COP presidency as an implementation COP to put into action the Paris Agreement, since the Paris rulebook was finalized at COP26 in Glasgow. It is also being seen as a make or break gathering for Africa, in which the developed world will be asked to demonstrate whether it can mobilize the resources needed to fight climate change. India is being represented at COP27 by the Union Minister of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, Shri Bhupinder Yadav. India has said it is supportive of Egypt's efforts to make this an implementation COP, as over the last 12 months, the world has seen the widening gap between the statements by developed countries at COP26 in Glasgow and the reality of their actions. India will support the Egyptian presidency for a plan of action that answers the needs of developing countries. Adaptation and loss and damage are two issues at the center of attention, and a progress on these two issues will complement each other. At a time when the goal of $100 billion per year of climate finance by 2020 and every year thereafter through till 2025 is yet to be achieved, India has also said it looks forward to substantial progress on the discussions related to climate finance and clarity on its definition. So what can we expect at COP27, and how is India leading the fight against climate change? To provide the answers, I am fortunate to call upon two leading authorities. With me in the studio is Dr. Sunita Narain, one of the world's top environmentalists and a champion of sustainable development who pushes for green changes in policies, practices and mindsets. She has been with the Center for Science and Environment since 1982 and is currently its Director General. And joining us from Sharm el-Sheikh is Dr. Arunabha Ghosh, an internationally recognized public policy expert, author, columnist and institution builder. He is the founder-CEO since 2010 of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, which is rated among the world's 20 best climate think tanks. He also serves on the Government of India's G20 Finance Track Advisory Group and on the UN Secretary General's high-level expert group on net zero commitments of non-state actors. A very warm welcome to both of you. Let me begin with you, Dr. Narain. The last time you were in this studio was when COP26 was taking place in Glasgow.
That's right.
How much has changed since then in terms of the impact of climate change? And what has been the effect of the Russia-Ukraine war in particular on carbon neutral goals in Europe?
No, I think this is a nightmare moment, Vikas. I mean, at some level, as a climate change activist, somebody who's been talking about climate change for the last 30 years, 3 decades, I find today is the worst time. On one hand, we are seeing literally what I would call the revenge of nature. It's 1.1 degrees centigrade rise only, and you're already beginning to see extreme weather events across the world. You, in your introduction, have spoken about them, and this is devastating for the poor in the world. They are victims of climate change. They have not created the problem. And yet we are also finding rich world, poor world, both severely impacted by what scientists said would happen. On the other hand, you have the war. I mean, when you and I spoke last year, we were just coming out of COVID and we were looking forward now for action on climate change, for the world to start seriously talking about the reduction in emissions that the industrialized world has to take, the finance, the adaptation, so that the developing, the emerging world can grow differently. Today we are worse off. You have high energy prices in large parts of Europe, in the US. You have a situation where they are reopening their coal-based power plants. They're going back to reinvestment in fossil fuel. They say it is temporary, but you and I know once that investment is made, it's very hard to wean those countries off. And then there is the talk of recession, there is the talk of inflation, which means that all the promises, the finance promises, the question of loss and damage is going to be critical. There's only one thing that we need to keep our sights on, and that's the little point of hope. The fact is, these extreme weather events are showing the world that we have run out of time. And I think if COP27 can recognize that and at least come up with a reparation liability regime, it would be very important as we move forward.
Dr. Ghosh, now India's Minister of Environment, Forests and Climate Change has said that India expects action on climate finance, technology transfer and capacity building at COP27. What are your own thoughts on that? And what has been India's own role in technology transfer and building capacity of developing countries to combat climate change?
Thank you, Mr. Swarup, for having me in this conversation. First of all, we are trapped in a climate finance debate about a negotiated maximum and a delivered minimum. Since 2009, we have been entrapped in the story about $100 billion, this elusive $100 billion that never shows up. But actually what we need is trillions that need to flow to the billions that live in the developing world. And therefore, the most important thing here now in terms of climate finance is not just quibbling about the definition. It is about actually being able to convert climate finance into climate investment, which is to take the public finance that comes and use that to leverage many more multiples of private investment that comes into the sustainable infrastructure in developing countries. The other issue when it comes to technology, and again, one of the pillars of the UNFCCC is technology transfer. But if you actually evaluate dozens of initiatives that have been launched over the years, we see that there has actually been very minimal technology transfer. So therefore, we need a new paradigm of technology co-development, which is that the global north, but also the global south, have a stake in the emerging technologies of the future. We cannot have a sustainable planet that widens rather than narrows the technology gap. And therefore, if you look at how India has approached this, not just in terms of the negotiations, but the kind of initiatives it has created over the years, I'll give two examples. One is the International Solar Alliance, which was launched on the first day of the Paris Climate Talks in 2015, formally launched in 2018. It already has 110 member countries, signatory countries. But if you look at the kinds of programs, solar for agriculture, so an aggregated demand from 22 member countries for more than 200,000 solar-run agricultural irrigation pumps, or solar for mini-grids, or solar for storage, or solar for rooftop. These are the kinds of technologies that are not just large-scale investment. These are the types of deployments that make sense for smaller developing economies. So you're taking the same technology, but designing programs that are most salient for that technology co-development idea. And similarly, another example is the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, another initiative that India has launched. It has now 31 member countries plus several international organizations as its members. 22 of these countries are from the developing world. But again, if you look at the kinds of initiatives, something that India launched last year, along with Maldives and Fiji and so forth, was called the Infrastructure for Resilient Island States. So when we talk about the small island states that are near sea level, that are most impacted by rising sea levels, you create programs that are directed towards the kind of resilient infrastructure that will make sense to them, or have granular hyperlocal analysis of their infrastructure so you can then try to bring in the investment and the insurance coverage. These are just two examples of how India's approach towards this is not just going to climate negotiations and demanding certain things, but also trying to create platforms that have salience and relevance in the very vulnerable times that we are living.
Sunita ji, let's talk about that elusive $100 billion a year in climate finance for 2020 for climate action in developing countries that was promised at the COP15, I believe, in Copenhagen in 2009. We are nowhere near reaching that goal. Why is it that in 2022, we are still discussing the definition of climate finance?
Because we are living in a very intensely unequal world. That's the bottom line of it, Vikas ji. At the end of the day, let's be very clear. When it comes to definitions that apply to us, those are written in such great detail and such complicated language that even we fail to understand what it means. I'm talking about the clean development mechanism and the layers of definition that were created for a word called additionality, for instance. But here, it is the rich countries, the industrialized countries, who have to actually transfer these funds. And you see here the complete opaqueness in the definition. So if you look at OECD, which has put together this sort of listing and has said, we are very close to the $100 billion. But then their own organization, Oxfam, has actually taken that apart and said that it's actually 1/5 of it, because you have lumped in climate finance everything, including every road project that you have cleared, every bilateral agreement that you've had, every loan you have given. A few years ago, we had found that the Exim Bank in the US was was giving loans for solar in India, and even that was put into climate finance. So I think it's very important in this COP, and I think that's something that the Honorable Prime Minister raised last year, and I think it's very important that the Indian government makes it clear that we need clarity. So finance is not the issue. We need clarity about what do you mean by climate finance, so that we can track, measure, and then monitor. And that really is one of the most sticky issues, I believe, in this COP.
Dr. Ghosh, now you have argued in a recent paper that the fight against climate change is best addressed through industry-focused coalitions which can show sectoral progress rather than through multilateral diplomacy involving 200 plus countries. Could you explain to our viewers how this will work in practice?
In fact, it is in practice that we have to, focus our attention. There is a value to the multilateral process, but if you actually look at climate action, we have to look at where the technologies are going to get developed, who is going to bring in the resources, who is going to create the demand, who's going to create the rules, who's going to create the standards, how are you going to ensure the trade, how do you ensure that, again, as I mentioned earlier, that we don't have a sustainable planet that widens rather than narrows the technology gap. Therefore, if you take examples, specific sectoral examples, steel, it is a fundamental critical industry in all major economies. And yet the processes of making steel have to become significantly greener, not just on the energy efficiency side, but on the fuel switching side, moving away from coal-fired blast furnaces towards green hydrogen fired shaft furnaces. But you can create a coalition of countries that are working specifically in this area. India is the second largest steel producer in the world. Can it become the largest green steel producer in the world and become part of a critical supply chain? Similarly, whether you take sustainable aviation fuel, if you look at sustainable cement, if you look at green ammonia for fertilizer, these are all areas where different types of businesses, governments that help to de-risk the investments, even catalytic funding from philanthropy can create these coalitions or alliances that are sectorally focused, but you create standards that are not within individual countries. If you otherwise leave it to, laissez-faire, so to speak, then what will happen is that mercantilist trade barriers will start emerging in all these economies. So the EU will set its own standard for green hydrogen and the US will do its own thing. And then we will wonder, how did our market not grow? So it's very important that this paradigm of technology co-development pools in resources that are human, technical, and financial, jointly develops projects in different geographies, not just a green steel plant in northern Sweden where no one lives, but somewhere in India, for instance, jointly co-owns the intellectual property. So you're not constantly begging for, concessions on the IP rules, but rather actually have a stake in the emerging technologies, and jointly aggregates the demand so that you have the largest companies and their supply chains demanding these greener intermediates, which then begins to green the supply chain overall.
Dr. Narain, now India is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change. Not only is India's economy highly dependent on climate-sensitive sectors such as agriculture, forestry and tourism, but more than half of India's population lives in rural areas and relies on climate-sensitive ecosystems. In this context, how important is climate adaptation? And what is India's view on the global goal on adaptation?
So two things. One, let me take forward what Dr. Ghosh has said on iron and steel. We have just completed a very detailed assessment of the Indian iron and steel industry and actually presented what we are calling an accelerated roadmap. Now, the issue here is, and I think that's important for India now, to look at where the co-benefits are for us. I mean, if you look at our iron and steel industry, critical for growth, but also a huge opportunity for us to be able to use recycled steel to clean up, to be able to look at standards where we can actually improve both in terms of local air pollution, but also in terms of greening the sector. And I think that's also a huge, in my view, the climate challenge for us in India is really one of co-benefits. And that's really where the issue of adaptation also comes in. You're very right in saying we're very vulnerable. We will need to have a massive investment to make sure that we can build the resilience of people. Because if you don't, you will see increased migration. And increased migration means more pressure on urban areas, more demand on services, which then means our urban infrastructure also starts collapsing. Now, when you talk about adaptation, and that's the zillion-dollar question, what do you mean by adaptation? Okay, in my view, we have created a newfangled word which nobody understands, and all the scientists of the world are sitting there trying to make sense of the word adaptation. I will break it down to you to say it is about development. It is about speeding up development, keeping in mind that you will have to do poverty eradication faster, you will have to build resilience of your land and water systems, you will have to build ability of people to have labor from natural resources so that they can get money where they live, and you will of course have to make sure that all your infrastructure that you provide is able to withstand the fury of nature.
And what about the global goal on adaptation?
So the global goal on adaptation is words, nothing else but words. Nobody is serious about it. If you look at the last many conferences, they are creating committee after committee after committee after committee. There is no goal. It's a committee. So I think we really need to call a spade, because, I'm too old at this, Vikas ji. I can't be genteel about this anymore. The world is not serious about these issues, and we'll have to invest. We'll have to talk about true financing, which can come, but we need to make sure that we understand the word adaptation better.
Dr. Ghosh, now India has set a target of 450 gigawatts of renewable energy by the end of this decade, that is by 2030. And in fact, is the only country among G20 nations that is progressing rapidly to meet its climate goals. What has been the policy matrix and the implementation agenda which has allowed us to achieve this?
I think it's very important to understand the scale and scope of the energy transition that India is going through. So before I get into the 450 gigawatts, we also have to recognize that when the Sustainable Development Goals were announced in 2015, India had the dubious distinction of having the largest number of people without access to electricity. We now have up to about, our independent estimates at CEEW suggest about nearly 98% of households have been electrified. This penetration of access to clean cooking energy through LPG cylinders has gone up from over 50% of households a few years ago to over 80% of households. This is a scale of energy access, the fundamental core of development, that has not been achieved anywhere else so rapidly. And it is in parallel to this basic access to energy that the system change is also underway. In 2010, when the National Solar Mission began, we had only, or rather less than, 20 megawatts of solar. We now have nearly 60,000 megawatts of solar. We have 115,000 megawatts of solar and wind and small hydro and biomass. If you include large hydro and nuclear, we have 165,000 megawatts of non-fossil capacity. And going for 500,000 megawatts of non-fossil capacity by 2030, the first major economy that will build more renewables than its entire electricity system within this decade. Now, what will we need for this? We will need that the materials, the manpower, and the money is available. We will need $200 billion of investment. Our mobility investments for clean mobility will be another investment opportunity of $206 billion. Our green hydrogen story will be another opportunity of about $100 to $140 billion of investment. So India is offering a market of over $500 billion during this decade. But in order for all of this to happen, we also need the finance at a cost that we can afford. It's not appropriate that you pay 1% or 2% interest rate in the United States and you're paying 14% interest rate or 16% interest rate in India, just because there's a perception that India is a riskier place to invest in. Yes, risks vary. But if our currency is depreciating, it's not because of us, it's because the US is raising its interest rates. Even I would say the first policy in the world that government of India has come out with in draft form of using distributed renewables for driving livelihoods. Our estimation at CEEW is that alone is a $53 billion market in India. So these policy frameworks on market design, auction design, procurement, guarantees, risk, hedging, different segmented policies, these are all the ways in which the solar story or the renewable story is unfolding, but also unfolding at a rapid pace, far faster than had been expected even a few years ago.
Sunita ji, now loss and damage is the other key issue at COP27.
Absolutely.
Referring to the economic, non-economic and ecological losses occurring due to extreme weather events and slow onset changes such as sea level rise. Now these are impacts that communities cannot adapt to.
Absolutely.
Annual loss, estimate of loss and damage could be between 290 to $580 billion by 2030, just in developing countries. At COP27, various countries are asking for the establishment of a loss and damage finance facility. Why is it so important?
So, loss and damage has been on the agenda from actually the first COP. Okay?
In Bonn?
No, actually as early as even when the Rio Convention, when the Rio meeting took place in Rio and the Framework Convention was being discussed, there was a talk about a damage based protocol, convention, mechanism. But obviously this was not acceptable to the developed world. In Paris, this issue was raised again at COP15. The unfortunate part is that it was made part of the Paris Agreement, a loss and damage facility. However, it says in the text clearly that this facility cannot be based on liability or on compensation. So, and you know this very well, you know how the United States and other countries are so, worried about a facility which would really be based on a principle to say you have created a damage.
The polluter pays.
The polluter pays principle. Now, the polluter pays principle is used across the world when it comes to environmental management. Why should it not be used here? And in my view, it's very important because if you set the right principle, you also have the right deterrence. If you say that the big polluters in the world have created a problem which has forced temperatures to go up, which in turn has led to this devastation in the world, then you create a mechanism in which there is a liability and there are reparations. Now, that is also going to be a deterrence for polluters not to pollute further. But the world is still looking to create a mechanism based on charity. That yes, it's a loss and damage facility, but because we are good people, we will be paying you money to take into account your losses. Now, I think that is where this COP is going to be make or break. The formal agenda of COP has included loss and damage as part of the negotiations. The question now is going to be, is the negotiations going to lead to a facility which is based on the principles which was set up at Rio, which is CBDR, which is based on common but differentiated responsibility, based on the fact that you have a set of countries, and our data clearly shows that these countries have created the problem, continue to create the problem, and will do so till 2030, which means that you need to make sure that the rich polluters pay for loss and damage, so that tomorrow, as other countries like India, like China yesterday, China is yesterday's United States. It will occupy the same amount of emission space as the US in 2030.
Dr. Ghosh, last year at the Glasgow COP26, Prime Minister Modi had introduced the LIFE movement, Lifestyle for Environment, a pro-people and pro-planet effort that seeks to shift the world from mindless and wasteful consumption to mindful and deliberate utilization of natural resources. How is it integral to the fight against climate change?
I think it's absolutely central that we don't think about climate change as only a techno-fix problem. I think one of the challenges we had for 30 years since the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was initiated is that we have thought of it simply in numerical terms, and we thought, yes, if there is a problem, we're ingenious humans who will come up with a technological fix. And then we keep squabbling about the technology transfer, about the finance, about the policies, but there's a fourth leg of the stool, which is behavior. And if the way of life of the most profligate people or the countries, and as well as citizens even in developing countries that have a very high, in certain sections, that have a very high footprint, if we don't control for that footprint, if we don't become more resource efficient, if we don't become more conscious about how we are developing, then we don't have a scope for solving the problem, because already humanity is consuming 1.6 planets in terms of natural resources on an annual basis. So we are drawing down the stock rather than replenishing it.
Well, on that note, thank you very much, Dr. Ghosh and Sunita ji, for joining our discussion today. COP27 marks the 30th anniversary of the adoption of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. In the 30 years since, the world has come a long way in the fight against climate change and its negative impacts on our planet. We are now able to better understand the science behind climate change, better assess its impacts, and better develop tools to address its causes and consequences. It remains to be seen how COP27 will contribute to global efforts to build our resilience, enhance our capacity to adapt, and, most importantly, raise the finances required to fund an energy transition sufficient to keep the planet below a temperature rise of 1.5 degrees Celsius. That is all I have for you in this edition of Diplomatic Dispatch. Till we meet again next week, take care and goodbye.